So greetings, good evening from Hong Kong. It's wonderful to be here. So I'm going to talk on the psychological aspect of Hong Kong, but I'm going to also bring in some history. So having started my working career actually as the grand age of 18 as an air traffic controller with the Royal Air Force in the UK, I've had a variety of diverse and interesting careers. It does not seem that retirement is around the corner, that's for sure. And indeed, I am busier now in Hong Kong than I've ever been in my life before, even when I was raising 3 children and doing a business in Australia and Perth. I'm ever hopeful that this busyness is leading me in the right direction of service. And after years of taking every time-consuming diversion a person can take on the spiritual path and getting lost on countless occasions, I am hoping that I'm at least on the path of return, and that through excessively hard work, as the teachings mention, I will become in this lifetime or perhaps the next what is referred to in the Rays and the Initiations book as initiate, who knows what he is. Or it could be just Maya taking me in another diversion. But here I am having the honor of presenting to you all at this Arcane School conference in London. So my present career in psychology started 25 plus years ago. And it's about the same time I started studying theosophy in Perth, Australia. So in this presentation, I'm going to explain a little bit about Hong Kong, its history and the present situation. I'm going to talk about the concept of esoteric service work and basically how it's starting to take hold within the territory. I'm going to talk about the work that's being done with the new generation of counsellors that I train. And I'm going to keep my experiences and insights to a minimum because at my age, a presentation of 35, 40 minutes is not going to be long enough. However, one thing I would like to do is mention an experience I had with one of my children. I believe this experience I'm about to share is one that epitomizes that of the aspirant. My youngest son was studying at Monash University in Melbourne, and he was trained to be a doctor. He was actually 17 years old, and I was living in Hong Kong, and he Skyped me as he was very stressed about his upcoming exams. We went through the usual breathing and meditative techniques, and all was going splendidly until I asked him to reach out to his soul. Just reach to the soul for clarity and guidance, I said. And then he immediately stopped. He stopped the meditation and shot back at me. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I can't find my soul. It's gone. It's just disappeared on me. We both paused for a moment and then we burst out laughing, which seemed the best cure for his stress as he said goodbye and carried on with his day. And yes, he passed his exams. Indeed, I think he found his soul in that laughter, the simplicity of a young person's psyche. The reason I'm bringing this story to your attention is to do with the concept of hope. I believe that many of us on the path of probation have felt like my son. Without that soul contact, we felt disconnected. My son felt lost, abandoned, and alone. And I'm sure that at some point in each of our lives, we have felt the same. Sometimes life has felt okay, and at other times really not so good. And this roller coaster of emotions was ever present as we attempted to meditate, become a better person, do service, try not to be selfish, connect with our soul, and write something on a meditation report when we really had nothing to say and could barely understand the meditations. But we kept pushing through and having hope. Hope that we would reach the destination's end, even if we were not sure what that destination was. Indeed, as I trundled along doing my spiritual work and service, many a letter was written that said, "Dear God, I resign, find someone else." But I kept going as I had hope about something. There was no clear vision, just hope that there was something more to this physical world. Every failure helped me to eventually find success. I kept going, and I'm so glad that I did. So when I view the world and all the lessons that are being presented, particularly now, I truly have hope for humanity's future, not just here in Hong Kong, but everywhere. the inherent good in humanity will shine through. And the soul of each of us, technically I know that's incorrect, but it'll have to do for now, will shine forth, creating the path of light that we're all working so hard to build. Hope was the only guarantee that Hercules had as he faced his 12 labors. Let us all hold on to hope, no matter what the external environment presents. So when I was first asked to do this presentation, Hong Kong was gripped in the crisis of student protests. These protests had the attention of the world, or so it seemed. I kept receiving messages from my family asking if I was still alive. Of course, then no one had heard of the coronavirus, which now has our undivided attention. However, once the name corona started to filter out of China, it was quick to catch on. This especially as the name of a very unhappy Mexican brewer that now faced the ignominy of being branded alongside the virus that would result in a global pandemic. It's a pandemic that has resulted in so many people making the transition and the economic collapse of nations and businesses. But looking on the bright side, where the cup is always half full, the environmentalists have something to be pleased about. And as esoterics in training, perhaps we at the Lucis Trust also have something to celebrate. A noisy world which was deaf to the calamity of materialism and separation, and which seemed to drown out the quieter voice of the soul, has quietened down some places and is working together. Yes, borders have closed, and some nations are advocating isolation and preservation of self. But many groups of goodwill are being formed which don't recognize borders. The scientific communities are working together to find a cure, which makes our electric bridge meditation more worthy and potent. Communities and humanity as a whole are stepping up to help those less fortunate than themselves. And it is not just in the Western world that this altruism is being displayed. This is a global phenomenon. Not since the Great World Wars has the world come together to fight, not the axis of evil and a physical manifestation of material desire, but a virus, which is definitely a little more hidden. Indeed, this hidden virus may be a good indicator of the darkness which has been allowed to permeate humanity and all nations. A desire that advocates separatism and has attempted to destroy the synthesis of nations working together. The United Nations being one of the first global manifestations of that synthesis, but which itself is under siege and being heavily criticized. Because of COVID-19, a dark world has been exposed to bright light, and the law of love that no man, and dare I say nation, liveth unto himself, led to this present global effort to pull together for a common cause. And further good news, the planet is not being decimated in the process. There are no bombs going off. In fact, quite the opposite. The planet is being allowed to heal itself, and most of humanity is working together as one family to deal with this pandemic. The fact that the planet can quickly heal itself, if not polluted so heavily, is also noted. COVID-19 is perhaps the wake-up call we needed to change. There will be more suffering and many more people making the transition, but if rightly understood, the lessons being presented may yet be in time to provide a future for our children who could not have imagined just last year. A future on a planet that will survive and a global community that will work together. We can only have hope. It is interesting that a realization of the fragility of an unreal and separative way of living has occurred. Humanity has been made aware of the folly of the selfish use of money, with its accompanying material desires over health and well-being. As was so eloquently put by an ambassador of the UN, the next stage of humanity's evolutionary growth is to face the crisis of freedom from material desire. In Hong Kong, this is particularly relevant. Sometimes here you feel that money and food are the only subjects people are able to talk about. But no matter where you are in the world, money is important. When too much energy is concentrated in one area, it's when abundance is focused on only material possessions to the detriment of emotional, mental, and spiritual growth. The divine circuitry flow, which determines the evolution and growth of the planet, and all of the energy forms which it influences, is disrupted. When nations selfishly work for their own betterment, to the detriment of others, there is no unity of consciousness, and the divine circuitry flow will be affected. And that brings harm to humanity and all the subhuman kingdoms. However, an embryonic unity consciousness is developing amongst nations, which is putting well-being, physical, emotional, and mental, ahead of material wealth. Despite their prevalence for money, the unity consciousness is something I believe the Asian communities have been moving towards faster than the Western worlds. And this is mainly because of the psyche of the common people, not because of the government. In Hong Kong, the family and community are of prime importance. The young are expected to be respectful and care for the elderly. A community environment is encouraged, and all high-rise complexes have parks to ensure the families can meet and the elderly can exercise. Hong Kong's environment is kinder to its elderly than the Western world. Of course, it is only relatively recently, that Hong Kong has started to care for its disabled, and the treatment of animals has improved radically in the last 15 years. But the sense of unity and of one humanity working together seems to come easier to Hong Kong than many Western countries. Hong Kong has been relatively successful in containing the coronavirus because of everyone working together and looking out for their neighbour. Indeed, it was a community initiative that helped Hong Kong to remain relatively unscathed. Before any government ruling, the community implemented social distancing and the wearing of masks. In the beginning, the only people not adhering to these self-imposed guidelines were mainly the Gwailos, which is the Cantonese term for the pale-faced non-Asians. And the masks were worn to protect the community as much as to protect oneself and family. Businesses supplied masks to the poorer communities, and they encouraged their workers to work from home. A choice was given. None of these instructions were compulsory. It was the voluntary collective effort of the people of Hong Kong to keep Hong Kong safe that helped the territory. Local charities and NGOs stepped up their work in anticipation of what was about to unfold. This was a community that was taking responsibility and not waiting for others to save them. By the time the government implemented their laws, they were mostly in place. However, Hong Kong's other crisis, the student protests, were different from the virus crisis. The student protests split the community apart. They were particularly devastating to Hong Kong and families, as the culture in Asia is to all show respect to elders and to really do as you're told. Families and communities had always worked together. The protests were the first time internal family members had been pitted against each other, normally the young against the old, and all in service of a cause each one believed in. The increasing violence of the protests and the wanton destruction from groups of hardcore protesters ripped families and communities apart. But interestingly enough, almost overnight, COVID-19 has brought them back together again. Quite the paradox that two perceived negative events could affect humanity in such a negative, but also positive way. Now, I've been traveling when I returned to Hong Kong on the 15th of January, 2020, and word was leaking out of China that there was a virus that was having devastating consequences in the town of Wuhan in the Chinese province of Hubei. In Hong Kong, we watched with interest, and having suffered the SARS virus in 2003, there was an expectancy and almost a feeling of dread amongst the people. Now, when I refer to the people of Hong Kong, there are certain groupings which you should be made aware of. There's the indigenous Hong Kongers who've never left the territory, and they're generally the low-income earners. The Hong Kongs of Asian descent who left the territory in 1997. but who eventually returned with their families, and these ones tend to be more affluent and have dual nationality. The expatriates, who come to Hong Kong temporarily with the intention to return home. The grown-up children of expatriates who stayed in Hong Kong once their parents departed, and a whole generation of older expats who intended to leave but have decided to retire in Hong Kong, which is me at the moment. And then there's the mainland Chinese, and I apologize if I've missed any people. So as word spread about the virus, the sense of dread deepened, but it was not a case of what am I, the individual person, going to suffer. Instead, there was a collective Hong Kong voice that kept saying, poor Hong Kong, poor Hong Kong. The regret was for the territory as a whole, animal, which includes humans, vegetable and mineral. It was revealing that the people I spoke to, and that included all generations, were saddened that the territory as a whole would suffer. So before I go any further, I believe it'd be useful to give a very, very, very brief history of Hong Kong. So the territory is situated in the southeast coast of China, strategically positioned on the Pearl River Delta and the South China Sea, while providing a safe harbor in a typhoon-prone area. It is known as one of the most thriving and cosmopolitan cities, which I can attest to, having lived here on and off for 30 plus years. Hong Kong is a fun place to live and to visit. Hong Kong Island became the property of the British in 1842 at the end of the First Opium War. The British had guns and warships, and so over the next 60 years, they bullied their way up the Pearl River Delta while occupying the area known as Kowloon, you can see on the map, and the New Territories. The area ceded to Hong Kong by the Chinese dynasty in the 1800s has a street at the line of demarcation unimaginably called Boundary Street. And it's interesting to note that in the 100-year lease that ended in 1997, it was only the area in the New Territories north of Boundary Street. That's the green areas. Hong Kong Island, Kowloon, and the New Territories as far as Boundary Street, the white areas. And that's quite a sizable acreage. Now, this was owned outright by the British and did not need to be handed back to China. So Hong Kong quickly became a bustling hive of activity. And in the early 20th century, the city's population was bolstered by refugees, mostly from China's Guangdong area, which is the closest province to Hong Kong. Hong Kong became a manufacturing hub, which continued until the borders with China became more open and the manufacturing moved to China, and Hong Kong focused more on the financial sector. Throughout it all, the city thrived. And although it may have been reinvented a few times with harbour reclamation, amazing architecture, and the decimation of the rural lands, the spirit of Hong Kong has always been positive, despite its ups and downs. In the past, the combination of British and Chinese energies worked well together, and Hong Kong still thrives as a community, even as the Chinese influence over the city becomes more prevalent. Of course, those of us who have studied the Alice Bailey books will not be too surprised to discover that the personality rays of China and the UK are compatible in their oddness. China is a third ray personality, and the UK is a first ray. The combination of these two rays perhaps helped Hong Kong to be so successful materialistically. And with the recent influence of the first ray of Shambhala, Hong Kong has thrived. However, Hong Kong is not a place without its downs, and throughout the short history, it has experienced periods of crisis, tension, and emergence. The student protests were most definitely a major crisis point for Hong Kong as a territory. While the global COVID-19 virus still affects Hong Kong, the student protests have faded almost, but not quite, out of sight. It was probably harder for Hong Kong people to stay detached from the protests than the virus. But it must be borne in mind that human evolution is continuously influenced by cycles of crisis and tension. The tension period is when things must be changed, so we can learn the lesson presented and allow ourselves to emerge out of the experience with a more evolved consciousness. But protests are not uncommon in Hong Kong, but it was the scale of the protests in such a small territory that was interesting. Last year's student protests started with 2 million people taking to the streets, with only a few days' notice, to take part in a peaceful demonstration. Because of time restrictions, I'm only going to mention some of the protests or riots that are in the 21st century. So in 2005, the democracy protests, the people trying to be allowed more freedom in choosing a government. Because the system here is that China put forward delegates for the Chief Executive and Legislative Council, which is the Hong Kong government. So in 2005, people protested about that. 2010, universal suffrage, and this is really where the pro-democracy movement got going in Hong Kong. And then in 2011 to 2012, we had Occupy Central. Now, this was a 10-month protest which brought the center of Hong Kong to a standstill. It was against economic inequality and corporate China influence over the government, and it literally was the main artery on Hong Kong Island that the tents were set up. In 2012, there were other protests, and then in 2013, more protests. But then we come to the significant one of the 2014 Umbrella Movement. The Umbrella Movement and Occupy Hong Kong are synonymous terms and originated because of proposed electoral reforms to Hong Kong that would allow the Chinese Communist Party to vet the chief executive of Hong Kong. That's the Hong Kong government. There were student protests, there were class boycotts, and the students protesting the interference of China with the government's election of the chief executive became quite heated. In 2019 to 2020, the Hong Kong protests were the result of the chief executive, Carrie Lam, which is the latest protests, attempting to introduce a fugitive offenders amendment, which would allow extradition to China. The first protests with 2 million people of all generations doing a peaceful, it was almost like a family outing really, marching through the streets of Hong Kong. And the government chose to ignore this. And 9 months worth of mass marches followed, eventually becoming quite violent. But why is it in the last 70 years have there been so many protests in Hong Kong? And why such large and influential protests in the past 10 years? Could it again be to do with the rays? I'm not an expert on the rays, but I have been pondering this question for a while. As the sole influence on consciousness, the astral body starts to permeate all of society. Could the Hong Kong people who are influenced by the colonial energy of the UK be clashing with China's influence? This clash epitomized by larger and larger violent emotional protests against the pro-mainland China-Hong Kong government. As the book Destiny of Nations states, the sole rays of China and the UK are China is first ray and the UK is second ray. Could this uneven combination of odd and even ray influences be contributing to Hong Kong and China's protesting history of late? Now, I agree this is a very simplistic way of looking at the rays, but living in Hong Kong and having traveled extensively in China, the quality of the two cultures are very different, but not the materialistic intent. And if you want some insight into the psyche of the Hong Kong people, I think that an incident that happened during the protests might be a good example of them demonstrating their complexity. I was very fortunate or unfortunate, depending on your point of view, to be involved in some of the protests in Hong Kong. So let me give you some first-hand knowledge of what it's like to be on the front line of the protests. The protests have been going on for some months, but they were mainly restricted to the weekends. It was generally accepted practice to avoid the city on a Friday night, Saturday, and a Sunday. Until the fateful Monday, when the protests, which were rapidly deteriorating into riots, descended on the university campuses throughout Hong Kong. Hong Kong University, or HKU as it is known, was one such location. When the students targeted the universities, the violence escalated. This is a picture that I took outside Hong Kong University. So as it turned out, on a certain Monday, I had a meeting at HKU. As I left the MTR, our subway, I encountered the strange sight of riot police running past me. As I exited the MTR, I saw that the main road in front of the university gate was blocked, and something had been set alight. My meeting at HKU just happened to be on the day the student protesters decided to attack the universities. It was very interesting to come out of the station and find myself in the middle of a riot. All traffic had been brought to a standstill. There were students on balconies and bridges chanting at the police. There were the local Hong Kong people shouting at the students to behave themselves and go back to their class. And the riot police were racing around with batons at the ready. I totally became the observer of the situation. There was no fear, no excitement, nothing really, but the scene in front of me. And in that observation, I noted the eyes of the riot police, and they looked terrified. These particular riot police were only young children dressed up and trying to act like adults. As I continued to observe the scene, I noticed that the locals were angrily waving their fists at the students. Bus drivers were looking bored. And as I looked up at the balconies and the bridges across the road, they were lined with black masked students. And they seemed totally calm and in control as they chanted their slogans. I spent a few moments looking at this utterly surreal landscape. And then I was brought back down to earth as I realized I might be late for my meeting. And as my meeting was in a location at the other side of the road, there was only one thing to do. Now, I'm not sure I was following Patanjali's edict for dispassion as displayed here, but without a care for the personality, the form, or even remotely recognizing any limitation, I basically hoisted up my skirt, legged it across the road, jumping over the debris, and landed at the other side of the road, the side I needed to be on to attend my meeting. It was only then that I realized the whole place had gone silent. I think an old grey-haired apparition legging it across the road took everyone by surprise, including me. And then for a moment, everyone came together and cheered. That was when my dispassion was set aside as the personality came to the fore and I did a small bow and set off for my meeting, which had been cancelled as a result of the riots. Now, you might wonder what this story has to do with esotericism, but I believe it has everything to do with it. It is said by the Arcane School HQ group in one of the letters, I can't remember which one, that as a result of human consciousness not having been measured or even defined, we are the greatest of creatures living on the planet. It is consciousness that defines the nature of each person, and consciousness which enables relationships between one person and another. As humans, we are constantly discovering more about our environment, and each new experience helps us to expand our consciousness. On that day in HKU, I witnessed chaos and then I witnessed beauty. So many groups working against each other, but also together in many diverse ways. We're not in a position to judge their motives, but there were definite groups of people, and each one of them was working together to posit their message. Never before had HKU or the students, riot police and locals experienced such a gathering. This was not regular behavior, and in its newness of experience, everyone in some way or other experienced an expansion of consciousness. The new areas of awareness may not have been on the mental plane for some of these people, but as they shouted insults at each other, and then within a few moments were cheering together, a fuller appreciation of the innate complexity of humanity came to mind. At every level, we work from darkness to light, from personality to soul control. And if in some infinitesimal way that is achieved through groups of people at student riots cheering and then jeering, or jeering and then cheering, then so be it. The invocative appeal, lead us from chaos to beauty, was presented before me that day as a symbol of the future and of karma being transmuted. Indeed, I was talking with a colleague who is interested in mental health, but not at all spiritual. She's a lecturer at City University, where some of the worst protests took place. Indeed, as I was leaping across debris at HKU, she and other staff were attempting to get students out of City U, just as the protesters stormed the university, setting off fire alarms and activating water sprinklers in an attempt to destroy the facility. She said it was devastating to watch the destruction of the university. It was quite profound. But she believes that good will come out of it, and Hong Kong will grow in become a better and a brighter place. As she and I sat in the midst of COVID-19 outbreak, having a lovely cup of tea with the sun shining brightly in a blue sky, something rarely seen in Hong Kong, which gets heavily affected by the pollution from China, my colleague said something that I felt was so true in relation to Hong Kong. The protests fragmented Hong Kong society into two camps that were so deeply divided and unable to see any common ground between them. But COVID brought Hong Kong collectively back together as a family, looking out for each other and for small businesses. And so now we come to the coronavirus and living in Hong Kong during this latest crisis. Hong Kong is probably better off than most nations across the world, as we've been able to operate with relative freedom. Meetings were allowed until very recently, and we can still go out to restaurants as long as there are not more than 4, they've relaxed actually now to 8 people together. And we keep mindful of social and physical distancing. This was very fortunate, as at this time of need, I decided to establish meditation and triangles groups in a location, i.e. Hong Kong, that knows nothing or so it appeared to me about esoteric wisdoms. Before the prohibition of meetings, a small group of us established monthly full moon and new moon meditations in Hong Kong. These were moved online as a result of physical and social distancing, and now the Hong Kong group combines with Perth, Australia, and Turkey and Japan. There's a good following. We even had a WESIC online talk and gathering, and it is hoped that more and more people will learn about the teachings of Lucis Trust, and at last the blue books, or the Alice Bailey books, I call them the blue books, are taking hold and being read, even if they're not fully understood. Over 20 years ago, I did a similar thing in Perth, Australia, and I know the teachings there continue, with the Great Invocation being used daily by hundreds of people. Hong Kong is not as developed as Australia, but in the last few months during this period of crisis, the Hong Kong group have established very active full and new moon meditations. And we follow the Lucis Trust format. We have over 100 people in the network, Australia, Hong Kong, and South Africa. And since these slides have been made, we're also including Turkey and Japan. We are running weekly Monday online triangle meditations. Much as I miss Kathy's presentation, 3 in the morning got too much for me, so we decided to start some in Hong Kong. It's short, but it's live. It's only for 15 minutes, but it's a good start. Reiko and her Tokyo group join us each week. And we have formed triangle groups between Japan and the Hong Kong groups. At present, we have over 21 triangle groups registered with the Lucis Trust from the 3 nations of Australia, Hong Kong, and South Africa, and I believe we'll be adding to that very soon. We've established a soul conscious community website and social media platforms. The website has been registered with the Lucis Trust, and we hope will be added to the global network soon. We have workshops that discuss the divine plan, as far as we can understand it. And it is hoped these workshops will be a starting point for the students to move to the Arcane School. I work extensively also with Monash University's Master of Counselling students in Hong Kong, and a new vocabulary is being established within their practicum units. Detachment, discrimination, and dispassion are qualities being developed by all students. Even if the personalities do not understand the esoteric meaning, we know that their souls do. And as everything in the unconscious will one day be made conscious, there is hope that harmlessness and right speech will permeate all areas of societies and throughout all nations. There's no doubt I'm a person who believes in the cup always being half full. Hong Kong has not emerged fully from the crisis and tension evoked by the Hong Kong student protests and the virus. But I am ever optimistic for the future of Hong Kong and all of the human family. We may have a way to go before we are living as disciples on the path of initiation. But I do have high hopes for all of us and the subhuman kingdoms for which we as the one humanity are responsible. But let us not return unchanged. Let us come out of this making better choices and with changed habits. Let us work harder within our own practice and as a group of world servers to reach into the silent place as we assist the hierarchy to turn darkness into day. The theme for this conference is that the forces of creative life circulate and the law of elevation control. As I sit here talking with you from Hong Kong, let distance be irrelevant. Let group realization be our goal. And let group consciousness permeate every thought, action, word, and deed. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Liz. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yep.
That was an absolutely brilliant presentation on so many different subjects, and all done at about, what, 10 in the evening? You're still with us, so energetic and positive. I think you're such a good example of someone who learns and has learned through experiment, experience, and expression.
Definitely.
And I particularly loved your comment, dear God, I resign, find someone else, because I'm sure we all feel like that from time to time. But of course, you carry on as you have. And I would very interested to see just how the work, the triangles work, the full moon work is progressing in Hong Kong, Japan, and you've got links to South Africa and Australia. Just wanted to ask you, as far as the concepts go in Hong Kong, do you explain just very basically, you say you use the same outline as Lucis Trust for the full moon, say. Have you explained those concepts in some way?
What I do is I always do a short talk. So we have an hour session. The 50-minute triangles is just people come on and we just do a very welcome, and then we just do the triangles. But for the other evenings, when I started the full and the new moon, initially I was doing them physical. And so I would always do a 15-minute talk and explaining about energy and just very gently introducing concepts of energy and just keeping it very simple. And then in that explanation, what I found was, because I was using the Lucis Trust meditations, I have a question and answer at the end of the meditation. People were asking questions relevant to things that they didn't fully understand in the meditation, but I kept it quite simple. I didn't go into, into the really deep esoteric stuff, because it was beyond most people when I first started. But now there's a group that's starting to form, which are asking, is there any way that they can, they learn a bit more? So, I mean, I put them through to the Lucis Trust, and some of them join, I know, in the meditations. But what I'm doing in the explanations is really just bringing it into not just esotericism. I'm actually trying to get them to take it into their everyday lives, and that's what's really important to people. So something like the evening review, which you were referring to earlier, I actually suggest to everybody they do that, and I do this during the talks of the meditations, that go and try an evening review and reflect on your day, And so I bring in the psychology as well as the, if you want to say, spirituality, and people are having a very positive effect, because in Hong Kong, people are, it's quite tangible. They like to see a shift. They like to see a change. So I'm really still experimenting with it, but it seems to be working at the moment. The balance of keeping it practical, you know, making sure it's practical, but also moving them up, elevating them, elevating their consciousness. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Liz, and I'm sure that people, our attendees, would like to ask you questions. So I'm just going to hand you over to Dominic now and to open up the Q&A. And thank you once again.
Okay, we have one hand raised. Ian Barton, if you could unmute yourself.
Excuse me.
I'll try to unmute you then. Okay. Doesn't seem to be working. Well, there's one more hand raised. I'll come back to you, Ian. Stephen, if you could unmute yourself. Okay, Stephen, go ahead.
Yes, it's been intimidating. What I want. Hello.
Hello.
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. What I want to know is, what is your view about the current protests going around in the world, started from the US?
What's happening in the US? Sorry, can you say that again? What's my view about what's happening in the US? Is that what the question was?
Yes. The protest is about the death of George Floyd.
The protests.
What's my view about the protests?
I think it's giving us another view about the racism and a new understanding about how we see racism. I want to know your point of view about it.
Liz, it's about, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes. Dominic.
Yes, it's about the protests in the US concerning the death of George Floyd and systemic racism.
What are my views on that?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, really, I tend not to get too wrapped up in, I mean, I know everybody's talking about it, but I personally don't get wrapped up in the individual things. I tend to kind of look at the bigger picture of it. So, I mean, I don't really feel in a position to comment on the US protests. I mean, I don't, it's kind of not my thing to, no, I really, yeah, I've got nothing really to say about the protests in relation to the US. I mean, I think people want to express themselves, they can express themselves. That's really, sorry, Stephen. I mean, I can't really give you any detailed answer on that because I don't really get over involved in the things like that.
Okay. The Emmanuel Sakefio, sorry if I mispronounced your name. Do you want to unmute yourself? Emmanuel? Hello? I'm trying to unmute you.
Okay.
Oh, no.
Is it okay now?
Yes. Is that Emmanuel?
Hello?
Maybe go to Catherine Cruz and come back to Emmanuel.
Yeah, Emmanuel can talk now. Yeah.
No, it was a mistake. I don't intend to say anything.
Okay. Right. We'll move on to Catherine Cruz. Allow you to talk. You can unmute yourself, Catherine.
Thank you. I live in Arkansas, which is in the middle of the United States in the South. And I think that one of the absolute, I think that the whole process of the riots is so important as a process of revealing that which has been concealed, because the surface appearance, the appearance in the United States is that racism has been addressed, but that is a very shallow cover over deep and abiding racial, I guess the word I would use is hatred, that one of the gifts of the horrendous, in my personal opinion, rising of Donald Trump to the presidency is that he has made that so evident, that white supremacy so evident, and the gift of the international response and support for what's going on here in revealing this horrendous pus of hatred in our nation and probably worldwide is, I'm very grateful for that. And so thank you for letting me have the chance to speak to this issue, which is taking place internationally, although it began here in the United States. Thank you.
Curtis, sorry, Liz, go on.
I think everybody has a right to protest. You know, people have got a right to protest. The Hong Kong protests, because I appreciate I mentioned protests in the talk, were the students really protesting for their right for freedom, and they have a right to protest as well. It's when it gets violent that it becomes problematic, I think. And that's perhaps where some of the issues come in. It's when the violence, the inherent violence that comes up. Sorry, go ahead.
Curtis Hoffman, if you want to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering, in light of what has happened on the mainland with respect to organizations like Falun Gong, whether as the mainland attempts to exert more control over Hong Kong, if there are any concerns about the blossoming of esotericism there.
I don't think it's going to affect it at the moment. If we become that big and it becomes huge, then that'd be wonderful in the sense that we get noticed. But at the moment, I think we're just little ants. I don't think we're big enough at the moment to affect too much. And certainly that's not a fear I have. I'm just going with what I'm proceeding with.
Thank you.
But thank you for bringing that up.
Pam Smith, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hello. I'd just like to go back to the point about the riots in America, because I think it's to do with the keynote of Gemini. Recognize your other self, and in the waning of that self, you grow and glow. And so I think it is revealing the lower self, you know, like the racism, and it's and we've got to look at it, and then we can change it, and then our other self can grow and glow.
Dom, I think we're going to have to bring the Q&A to a close now.
Okay.
Okay, sorry about that. Are there quite a few more people still?
No. Well, Ian, who unfortunately weren't able to unmute him. I don't know why.
Sure. Okay, no. Thank you very much. And thank you once again, Liz.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
And sleep tight.
I like to stay up. I'll stay up. Bye. Bye.